ask a kind of basic question, but it's almost like baselines things. I'll have Father John answer this first. Does ROCOR recognize holy orders in any true Orthodox jurisdiction?
Well, I know that we have received clergy from them, and so on some level, I would have to say yes.
All right, so the answer is yes, because there's been clergy received without being baptized and ordained again, you're saying.
Right.
All right, and so same question you, Father Joseph, about the true Orthodox receiving ROCOR clergy.
I would say that they would probably at least, I would say that it would be dependent on the circumstances, but it's always been that way, in the sense that, especially with the Greek Church, they make a much bigger deal about things like whether you were received by baptism or not. So in some cases, there have been cases, one of which led to a rupture between the Synod of ROCOR and Archbishop Maxentius, if they discovered, for example, that a priest was made, but he had not been, he came from Roman Catholicism, but he hadn't given a baptism but a chrismation. Sometimes they will do a corrective baptism, that sort of thing.
So in short, they'll recognize the holy orders of ROCOR, generally speaking, because obviously you can't speak for every true Orthodox jurisdiction.
Right.
But in the event that, let's say, that person was received into ROCOR in a way that they consider unsatisfactory,
Right.
those elements may be corrected.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, like,
and that's
just
oversimplifying. I should say that because, again, different true Orthodox.
No, I bring this up just so people, yes, there's a schism, but this is not to the same degree, being that there's recognition of holy orders there might be in some other situations. And so I want the audience to know this, because a lot of the audience is not even Orthodox, or Protestants that dabble in this issue, and Roman Catholics, and they don't know some of these basic things. A monk friend of mine was telling me, because he's a friend with a canon lawyer who's a bishop, I won't say the jurisdiction. But long story short, that the bishop has which true Orthodox jurisdictions they accept the holy orders and which they don't. So this is sort of for people to know things that they're aware of and that do exist. And I just thought maybe it's something that the audience might have not been aware of. So I just wanted to bring that to bear. Unless there's any other comments, I will move on to the next topic. Anything you want to add, Father John?
Not on that question.
And Father Joseph, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, no, I think I'm good for now. I mean, I was
Okay.
going to bring up a personal anecdote, but it's not necessary.
All right, well, we'll see where this takes us. So next question, and just again, for the sake of keeping things timely, how has ROCOR in the past created true Orthodox holy orders? Father Joseph, you mind give us a little bit of a background of how did ROCOR become intertwined with the hierarchies that exist today in some true Orthodox jurisdictions?
Well, if we're going, okay, that's a many-sided question.
Right.
Okay,
You got 3 minutes or less.
Oh, great. Okay, well, in that case, before the 1962 consecrations, which is how most people think in terms of the intertwining of ROCOR and true Orthodoxy, you have to deal with the fact that true Orthodox hierarchies, for the most part, it was just the Greeks, were small, pretty scattershot. There were 3 bishops originally. It went up to 7 bishops, and then it went up and down based on whether some left for the new calendarists or separated from the rest of the groups, etc. But it's important to remember that while this was occurring, it was not as simple as the Greek Old Calendarists and ROCOR. If you take into account the Vatopedi Synod in 1930, then at that point the Slav parties, when they were discussing with the Greeks, were actually horrified by the fact that they wanted to do concelebration. And so, for example, St. Nikolai Velimirovich actually gave chrism to the Old Calendarists before they had bishops. So, in Romania at the same exact time, you're finding it's absolute chaos because of the fact that the Romanian authorities are trying to establish a papal calendar. So while this is happening, ROCOR is basically in Serbia trying to survive. So to make great demands of the Russian Church abroad in the 1930s and 40s would have been ridiculous because, frankly, everyone was trying to just survive the onslaught of whether it was communism, Venezuelism, etc. So yeah, it was not pretty, but most people think about the background of the ROCOR True Orthodox unity occurring basically with clandestine ordinations that occurred in 1962 by Bishops Theophilus Ionescu, and who was a New Calendar Romanian bishop, although that was pastoral. And I've forgotten who the other bishop was, and I should have that.
I believe it was Archbishop Leonti of Chile.
Leonti of Chile. Thank you, Filipovich. Thank you very much. And so the point is that those original ordinations, etc., consecrations were clandestine in 1962. They were unknown to the rest of the ROCOR Synod even, and it wasn't until they eventually said under the table, like internally, what they did, etc. And by 1969, if I remember correctly, this is right after the lifting of the anathemas, about 4 years after the lifting of the anathemas in Constantinople, the bishops eventually talked in ROCOR and said, well, we did these consecrations, we're going to go so far as to recognize them. And that was under the presidency of St. Philaret of New York. And so that's really kind of how that started. Now, at the same time, there are movements like, for example, in Romania, there was a new calendar bishop who repented, Metropolitan Galactian Cardun. And so there's like small trickling movements trying to survive the state authorities, communism, etc. So that is part of the problem. So yeah, it was a different world than the one we think of, where we think of a unified world orthodoxy and true orthodoxy. It was an absolute global chaos for the better part of 40 years.
And we'll begin unpacking some of that. But Father John, anything you want to add other than the basics that in the 1960s, ROCOR played a role in reconstituting the Greek Orthodox Old Calendar's episcopal hierarchy?
Well, just a few details. There were bishops of the Greek Old Calendarists prior to that, but they died off. And so they were left with no bishops. And in 1962, you had these two bishops, as Father Joseph pointed out, one of whom was on the New Calendar. He was the head of the Romanian New Calendar diocese in ROCOR. We also had a New Calendar diocese that was Bulgarian at that time, and
which is ironic.
They did this without the blessing of the Synod, and actually the Synod of Bishops declared those consecrations to be invalid. But then later on, after the lifting of the anathemas, the Synod of Bishops decided to go ahead and recognize them. And then I think a couple years later, there was an attempt to actually enter into regular concelebrations and communion with the Greek Old Calendarists, but a couple years later they broke off because the position of ROCOR was the Greek Old Calendarists can't get along with each other. We'd be happy to be in communion with them or to concelebrate with them, but they need to get their act together. And so there wasn't any formal links between the two after that, although there were friendly relations with some bishops. But it was only in, I think it was 1996 that ROCOR decided to enter into communion with the Kyprianos Synod and also with 94. The Romanian, Bulgarian Old Calendar group that were in communion with them. And so I remember that I was in ROCOR at that time, so I remember that time very well. And one thing that was a bit striking about all that is that for about maybe a year or two, it seemed like everything was going along swimmingly. And then after that, you saw the bishop stop concelebrating. And I don't know entirely what was going on the Episcopal level, but we had actually two parishes in Houston, both of which later closed because the priests moved away. And in both cases, because the Archbishop had required them to not serve in storefronts, they had to build a chapel on their property. But when they had to move, that meant that the chapel went away. So the parish wound up going away. But anyway, we had good relations with them at that time. And I actually thought seriously about asking for a release to the Kyprianos Synod, just because the only ROCOR parish in the Houston area was doing most of the liturgy and feast day vigils in Slavonic, and these parishes were doing stuff in English. And I thought, well, gee, that would be preferable to the situation that I'm in. The only thing that kept me from doing it was my wife had her spidey senses saying, I don't think this is a good idea. And later on, I was glad that she had those senses, because even though there are a lot of good people in the group that I was familiar with, there were things about how they actually ran things that struck me as a bit squirrely, and I was glad to stay in ROCOR rather than to take that.
We'll unpack
departure.
the 2000s and the 90s and get into some of that. Let me just say one thing before I forget, just from what I know studying history, and I'm not an expert in contemporary Orthodox issues, but historically speaking, like let's say a metropolitan, a patriarch, a pope, they can't just decree something and it makes it so. You need the whole synod on board for these things, and that includes episcopal consecrations. And so it is something which doesn't get discussed a lot in online arguments, or people look into stuff in a passing sort of way where they think, oh, well, it was done by a bishop and that makes it so. But in a historical sense, we tend to want to look at these things synodically. Well, how did the synod respond to this action? The local synod, and then the world synods in conjunction with the local synod. This comes up historically, so it's, I think, something which will be telling when we look at some of these other issues we'll be unpacking on this question, is whether or not the synod makes something more convenient or less convenient to both sides' cases.